Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're looking back on the last 5 years of Gospel Tangents and some of the amazing historians that we've lost over the past year or so. So our next person to look at is D. Michael Quinn, a distinguished historian in Mormonism. And so I'd like to share a few thoughts about D. Michael Quinn. His name is actually Dennis Michael Quinn. He was born March 26, 1944 in Pasadena, California, and grew up in Glendale. Quinn served a mission for the LDS Church in England and graduated with a BA in English Literature from BYU. After he graduated, Quinn served 3 years in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War with 18 months of military intelligence agent, followed by 18 months in Munich, Germany. Following his military service, Quinn enrolled at the University of Utah, graduating with a master's degree in history. Quinn applied for the graduate program at Yale, where he graduated a PhD in 1976. After graduation, he took a job teaching and researching history at BYU. He also worked as a research assistant to church historian Leonard Arrington for 18 months. At BYU, he was named the best professor by one graduating class. Quinn taught at BYU until he resigned in January of 1988 due to ongoing pressure from some general authorities who wanted to see him leave the church. On September 26, 1993, Quinn was excommunicated from the LDS Church as one of the September 6th. So in this next part of our conversation, I wanted to share what Quinn's thoughts were as he looked back on this time when he was excommunicated. Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents podcast. I'm really excited. I've got a real rare treat. Mike Quinn, historian Mike Quinn, here in Salt Lake City. So could you introduce yourself to the audience? You know, not everybody knows about Mormon history and might not know who you are. Can you give us a little bit of your background?
I was born in California, and while I was there, which we were always told was the mission field, I became interested in Mormon history as a hobby when I was 16, and then it became when I was in the military and after I graduated from BYU in English literature, I had time to reconsider what I wanted to do as a graduate student while I was in the Army for 3 years, and I decided to switch to history because my hobby had become too consuming. So when I came out of the military, I went to the University of Utah to get a master's degree in history, and then I went from there to Yale. But before that, I served as a research and writing assistant to Leonard Arrington while he was the church historian. After I got my PhD in history from Yale, 3 months later I was hired by the BYU campus to join its Department of History, and I remained there for 12 years and then have been freelance historian, or the term is independent scholar in the field. Aside from occasional appointments, I had a 2-year appointment at the University of Southern California, and then I had a 1-year appointment at Yale University, and that was my last academic appointment more than a dozen years ago.
Oh, wow. That's cool. So for those who aren't familiar with your background, I know in the 1980s you wrote a chapter, I believe it was, in a Maxine Hanks book. Is that right?
Yes, it was actually 1992 that it came out. Okay. It was called Mormon Women Have Had the Priesthood Since 1843, and that caused a certain amount of controversy.
Yeah, could you tell a little bit more about that?
Well, Maxine was excommunicated, I was excommunicated, and she was specifically told that she was excommunicated because of her book, and I was told, and I'd given a list of 3 items showing my apostasy, the list provided by the stake president, and the first item on the list was that essay.
Was that essay? Okay. Now, yeah, so you're one of the, I guess, infamous September 6th, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So the one thing that I think would strike most people as a little bit odd, I know I listened to your Radio West interview earlier this week, And you mentioned that you're still a believing Mormon. So some people might think, well, if you're excommunicated, why would you still believe in a church that would excommunicate you?
I'm a seventh generation Mormon. Nothing can take that away from me. Mm-hmm. But even, there are many, my children are eighth generation Mormons, and they talk about Mormons in the third person. They couldn't care less about the church. So the fact that I'm an ancestral Mormon doesn't determine my faith. My faith is very basic, but it's basic in a way that I think many current members of the church might not understand. In many ways, I'm a 19th century Mormon believer. I believe in Joseph Smith meeting with angels and translating the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God, which at that time was a seer stone. And I believe that the leaders of the church, from Joseph Smith to the current president of the church, have the calling of divine prophets, seers, and revelators who have the right to receive God's revelations. But they don't always do so, and sometimes they are too passive, in my view, and don't seek those revelations in a direct way. But in my view, they have the right and the obligation to receive those revelations. I don't agree with all the policies of the church, and some of them I strongly disagree with. And to that extent, although I did not seek excommunication freed me from having to defend policies I thoroughly disagree with. And that continues till today. So I maintain my faith in a private way. I'm in some ways like a Latter-day Saint medieval mystic. I have had this feeling even since childhood that it's just you and me, Lord, against the world. And God and my relationship with Him was always preeminent. But the reason I always loved going to sacrament meeting and as I grew up, Sunday school, was that the communion was served at each of those opening services. And that was always very important to me, and that's one of the things that I miss deeply, as well as the temple. I used to be a temple worker in a variety of ways. I was a temple worker when I was a missionary. I was a temple worker while I was at BYU, and scheduled worker. And so the loss of taking the sacrament every Sunday at least once, and participating weekly as I used to in the temple ceremonies, that has been a deep loss. It's one that I miss all the time. But because I am kind of this mystic, I'm okay, and I don't worry about my relationship with God. But I'm no longer a member of the Church of Record, but no one can prevent me from believing what I believe.
So you still call yourself a Mormon, I guess?
I do, but I'm not a Latter-day Saint in the sense that I'm not a part of the LDS Church. Mm-hmm. So if people are attuned enough with the preferred language to ask if I'm LDS, I'll say I'm not a member, but I am a Mormon believer.
Okay. One of the other interesting highlights from my conversation with Dr. Quinn was his talk about the Deseret Hemp Company. The one thing I was leafing through, and I thought that one of the businesses had a very unusual name, the Deseret Hemp Company, and I thought, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, can you talk a little bit? Do you know very much about that?
Yeah. Well, hemp was a textile, and people grew hemp the way they grew. Trying to think of some other textiles that are flax or other things that could be used to make clothing. And Joseph Smith, by some of his neighbors, was described as a guy who wore hemp trousers, which were made from the plant, which was grown in the South generally, and then its final products were shipped north to manufacturing centers in Massachusetts. But in Utah, there was this idea that was economically wise, but it didn't always work out in practice, of Utah's residents being self-sufficient. And so in order to set up this self-sufficiency, Brigham Young, as church president and for a period of time as governor, established a lot of missions with an economic basis. So there was a flax mission, there was a cotton mission, which of course also caused the textile industry in Utah to grow. And then there was a hemp growing process, although it wasn't exactly a hemp mission, but there were general authorities who were involved in the growing of hemp and its use in manufacturing shirts and trousers. And so that was similar. It was a similar kind of enterprise to the cotton mission that Brigham Young had established in southern Utah. But that lasted longer and it was more successful. And as far as I know, I have no evidence of anyone smoking any of the hemp.
That's what I was worried about.
No.
Okay. Do you know when that ended? That hemp?
It was a kind of a short-lived, and I'm not sure why it didn't last as long as the wool mission was an animal byproduct. But that lasted a long time, and so did the cotton mission, which was a plant product, both used for textiles and manufacturing clothing. I'm not sure why. I don't know the details of the hemp manufacturing. Perhaps it's more difficult to do, and it may have needed more chemicals, which they would have had to import, and that might have diminished the appeal of trying to manufacture locally grown hemp into locally manufactured clothing.
Did they actually try to grow that here in Utah then?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Did it last into the 20th century?
No. In fact, none of these did. The cotton and the wool church-owned businesses basically ended around the turn of the century in the early 1900s. And so the clothing manufacturing that did continue for a period of time with general authority and church investment didn't depend on church-grown products, whether it was wool or whether it was cotton. By the time of the early 20th century, there was a secularization that was beginning, and so the church products were often shipped to distant locations that had little or no Mormon population, and they were importing products, raw materials as well. So the effort at being totally self-sufficient really ended around the 1880s, not long after the death of Brigham Young.
Okay, so the 1880s, that's good to know. Another highlight of my conversation with Dr. Quinn was to hear him talk about the church income. It was going to be amazing, $50 billion a year.
Typically, church headquarters from the 1950s to the 1990s has said 5 to 10%. That doesn't match any of the figures that I have from 1900s to the 1920s to the 1960s to the 1970s. So whether you take the low ball amount that I know is accurate in 1900s of 17% extra beyond tithing, or Eneld and Tanner's estimate in the 1960s or 70s of 40 to 45%, we're talking billions of dollars on top of the church's $33 billion tithing that I estimate as commercial income. So I think you could say $10 to $15 billion a year as of 2010 were coming from the various kinds of commercial investments. Businesses that are for-profit by definition, nonprofit businesses that sell some of their products to the public and therefore are taxed on those sales, and then the very large portfolio of the church. And to indicate how large it is, the investment houses, which again is a generic term I use, are scattered, and they know about each of their portfolios that they handle for the church, but they don't know about the other investment houses and what they handle and how much profit or loss they have in a particular day or a particular month or a particular year. But the central investment house from the 1990s to the present, as far as I know, has called Ensign Peak Advisors. And the president of Ensign Peak Advisors spoke with Deseret News in 2003, and he said that each day his company handled billions of dollars, and that's only one of the investment houses of the church. So I think that my estimate of tens of billions is probably close to the mark of commercial income from all the sources, not just the portfolio, but also for-profit businesses and nonprofits like welfare farms that also sell some of their produce to the public and are taxed on that.
Okay. So let me make sure I'm clear on that. So you're saying roughly $33 billion a year
plus
another 10 to 15 billion of business income.
So it's I would say as of 2010, $40 to $50 billion in total revenues from all sources.
Michael Quinn also had an interesting exchange on God and mammon. Could the church be accused of serving God and mammon, though, with some of these businesses?
The accusation is there, but typically it comes from people who don't recognize that the church makes no distinction between God and mammon. The church is a money-making operation, but it plows the money into the building of the kingdom of God on earth, which is a Mormon phrase that most members, even disaffected ones, will recognize. A member of the church, whether former member or current member in good faith, may feel uncomfortable with this huge portfolio that involves billions of dollars a day in transactions over the computer with only one of its investment houses. It may be members of the church and devout members, and certainly ex-members of the church, are uncomfortable or may be uncomfortable with the commercial real estate that produces and the commercial investments in mines and oil for a variety of reasons, not the least of which would be fossil fuels, for people who are concerned about that, and the church is heavily invested in fossil fuels. That is nonetheless a part of building the kingdom of God.
And finally, I thought it would be fun to talk about Quinn's association with Mark Hoffman. I've been talking with a few people about Mark Hoffman. So I don't know if you probably haven't followed some of my recent interviews. Shannon Flynn, George Throckmorton, who was the man who discovered how Mark was doing his forgeries. Were you involved with Mark Hoffman at all?
I met Mark Hoffman typically at meetings where we would cross one another in the hallway. There were some times when he was on a panel. I don't think he ever gave a full presentation of his own, but he was on a panel discussion, usually talking about some marvelous find of his in church history. And I've attended one or two of those that I remember. But usually at the Mormon History Association or at Sunstone Symposium, we would kind of pass one another in the hall, say, "Hi, how are you?" And he would go off to whatever session he was interested in, and I would go off to whatever I was, and not often were they the same. The only other times that I met with him was when I was at the church archives doing research. Typically, I avoided taking lunch. I would be there from the time the door opened until the time they threw me out. And I would never take a break for lunch, or rarely take a break for lunch. But I would be in there typing my notes on whatever document I was examining, and he would come in, sometimes alone, sometimes with someone else who was associated with him in one way or the other, and would come over and interrupt me. And I'm barely civil to people who interrupt me when they do research or when I'm doing research. And so I would, "Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, let me get back to what I'm doing." And so those were the kinds of conversations I would have with him. There was one time when he brought in the typed text of a document that he said he'd found in some attic, and happened at that time to be a document about the blessing of Joseph Smith III. And he said, well, what do you think of this? And it was like, wow, I'm interested in this. And I asked him if I could take notes. No. Can I type my own copy of this? No. Even though what he showed me was a typescript. And I never did see any of the documents that he was producing in real form. I only saw photographic productions of them, usually as published in the Deseret News or the Salt Lake Tribune or wherever, or sometimes in an article that was published in BYU Studies or whatever about them. And so that was the extent of our association. The only other thing that I did is I recommended, because I'd given up trying after years of trying to contact descendants of early Mormons who I knew had diaries. And there were two in particular that I recommended to him to follow up on what I knew. And one was William E. McClellan, whose diaries I had found described in a letter at the New York Public Library, and I had tried to follow through his obituary all the surnames of his descendants, not just McClellan, but daughters who had married, mentioned in his obituary. And then a man named Sylvester Smith, who died also in the Midwest. McClellan died in Missouri, it was a distant relative, really more of a shirt-tail relative of the Smith family, not a direct relative of theirs. Sylvester Smith died in Nebraska. And so his obituary said that he had kept the diary since he was 12 years old. And I thought, wow, this is something I want to, and it listed all, and he died in about 1885 or so, 1882. And the obituary listed all of his descendants who were living by name. And so I followed not only the descendants named Smith, which was going to be very difficult, but I also followed the children, his daughters, who had married with other surnames. And I went through telephone books, and I would get every telephone book in the Midwest for both these people, McClellan and the in-laws of Sylvester Smith. And I'd given up. I'd written hundreds of letters to these people over a period of years, never gotten back an answer from any of them. And I'd really just written it off as a lost cause. And so I made recommendations that for the McClellan descendants and for the Sylvester Smith descendants, I gave what I had in terms of the evidence of their keeping diaries during their lives to Mark. And I said, well, this is what you do. You contact descendants, and you've been very successful, I thought. And so, here's what I know about the evidence of their keeping journals. And he said he would, follow up on that and let me know. And then in the early 1880s, I was hearing that he had found contacts in the McClellan family about McClellan's papers. And so I was really upset that he hadn't let me know that he had made this contact. So I wrote him a letter, and I said, I gave this information to you years ago, and you promised to keep me in the loop if you were successful. And I've heard through some of your friends, who are mutual friends of mine, that you've made the contact with the McClellan family and have his archives, so to speak. And I said, I expect that you should allow me to at least see these and take notes on what I think is interesting. Well, I never heard back from him. And then one day in 1985, in early October, after the Sunstone Symposium, I was walking into the BYU library, and he happened to be walking out. And I said, did you get my letter? Yes. And I said, well, I think you owe me the opportunity to examine. And he said, well, I'm bound by agreements I've made with the descendants. And he said, I'll have to check with them. And it was very obvious he did not want to talk with me about this, and that he was uncomfortable, and he kept looking at his watch as I was talking to him. And so that was the extent of the last interaction I had with him. And then a few days, weeks later, boom, boom, boom. And he killed these people in premeditated murders. And this was, everything fell apart from that time forward, including his forgeries, his life of forgeries that he'd started when he was quite a young man. But that's the extent of my, you've got it. Everything that I knew about him and through personal contact, that was the extent of it.
So were you pretty surprised that he was actually the bomber?
Oh, yeah.
Or you thought he was
I just thought this was not the Mark Hoffman I knew, who was just very shy, very retiring person. I mean, I talked about him being uncomfortable and talking and looking at his watch, but the other times he barely got eye contact. I thought he was one of the shyest people I had met in Mormon History Association. And typically I learned more about what he was doing from friends of his like Brent Metcalf, who frequently socialized with him. I never socialized with Mark Hoffman, and I don't think he even never invited me to, even though I was interested in things he was interested in, and I passed on some of the leads that I had for getting stuff that I thought was in attics somewhere in the Midwest, and it turned out they were. But these people who acknowledged at one point receiving letters from me, it was like, who's this guy? And he's connected with BYU, and why should we believe him? And they were contacted eventually by a reporter from the Salt Lake
So
Tribune.
he probably got some ideas from his forgeries from you.
And he may have from things I published. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because typically I would talk about things that weren't available, that were central. Like I published an article about the Council of 50 Minutes and the Council of 50's history, and I commented about what I thought was in those minutes that I had not seen of the Nauvoo Council of 50. And so I would do this about other documents, like I wrote about the blessings that Joseph Smith III had received from his father, and that obviously was something that Mark Hoffman paid attention to. Mm-hmm. But in terms of conferring with him and planning out strategies, the closest I came to it was giving him these two sources about William E. McClellan and about Sylvester Smith, mm-hmm. that I thought would lead to him contacting somebody who had something squirreled away in an attic. And that was about the only consulting I ever did with him.
So you weren't concerned about getting blown up or anything?
Well, I got calls on the day that he was blown up with one that he had in his car. Mm-hmm. That people at the time thought had been planted in his car. Mm-hmm. I was told to, don't go back to the apartment you're living in, because at that time I was newly divorced and was living in a bachelor apartment. And so I had a friend who worked with the state attorney, U.S. attorney. It was in his office, and this longtime friend of mine called and said, don't go back home, go and stay with us, because no one would think of us, of him and his wife. And so he provided more than a week, I think a week or 2 weeks, of residence for me during this period. And then he told me, when you go back, look under your car for wires, and anytime you get, and for years after this, following his advice, anytime I got a package I wasn't expecting, I would take it to the post office and run it through their x-ray machine to see if there were any machines in it. So yeah, I was paranoid.
Wow, so there was pretty widespread then. There was a lot of people that were scared.
Yeah, yeah.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation looking back at Michael Quinn. He passed away on April 21st, 2021 at the age of 77 in Rancho Cucamonga, California. So I'm really lucky that we got to have Michael Quinn here on the show, and sad that he left us much too early. I know he was working on a book on polygamy, and I don't know what's going on with that. I'm hoping some other scholar picks up that work. So hopefully that will happen. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Kurt Bench, who was a friendly giant in the Mormon historians community.
And then when there's a third bomb, and then I find out that it's Mark Hoffman, that's the victim, I about drove off the road. And I remember hitting my steering wheel and saying aloud to myself, Mark, why didn't you listen to me?
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe for just $5 a month at patreon.com/GospelTangents, and you can hear the entire interview before everybody else. If you'd like to watch the entire video for just $8 a month, you can either subscribe on YouTube, Patreon, or my website, GospelTangents.com. Just click the yellow subscribe button, and I'll add you to our Gospel Tangents Insiders group so that you can see entire videos. For those interested in a PDF transcript, you can subscribe at either Patreon or on my website. For just $10 a month, I'll send you a PDF as soon as it's complete. If you'd like a copy of the paperback as well as a PDF, just sign up for $20 a month at either Patreon or my website, GospelTangents.com. Of course, you can buy individual transcripts at Amazon.com and just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview, and you can see all the things that we have there. Don't forget to support Gospel Tangents with an awesome t-shirt like one of these. You can subscribe at Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/GospelTangents. Get our latest updates at Facebook.com/GospelTangents. Also, you can get our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got more of our great videos. Thanks again.